The next episode of the Photography Basics. This time it's all about the aperture, what this is, how it works and how it affects a photo. Lightcolorshadow is the name and here we go. The aperture of a camera lens controls how much light is falling on the sensor. So you remember, the exposure time describes how long the sensor is exposed with light, and the aperture is responsible of the amount of light for the exposure. It does that by reducing the opening in the inner of the lens for less light. If you adjust a higher aperture, the bigger the number, the smaller is the opening, at the same exposure time you will get a darker image. So why should you set a higher aperture number? To receive more depth of field or just to darken your image? Because with a wide open lens the image would be overexposed, so one after another. To stay at the light topic, it is logic when the blades in the inner of the lens closing, that there will be less light which hits the sensor. So if I don't change the exposure time and set up a higher aperture number, like in this example, the image is getting darker because of less light. And to get this in mind, the bigger the f number, the smaller is the opening in the lens. The smaller the number, the wider is the opening. The depth of field is the next big thing when we talk about the aperture. This term describes how wide the range of sharpness of an image is. If you take a picture with the f-stop, aperture 2.8, the depth of field is not very big, but this depends finally on the focal length you use. When one uses a wide aperture on a 200mm telephoto lens, we stay at 2.8, the depth of field would be only some centimeters wide enough to get the eyes of an animal sharp. When one uses 2.8 at 40mm on a wide-angle lens, the depth of field is several meters wide. The open or a bit closed aperture setting is useful for portraits or if you want to separate your subject from the background because the background is getting blurry, but this on the other hand depends how far the subject is positioned from the background. So as you can see, it is all relative to another when we talk about the depth of field. But a simple rule is this: high aperture, a large depth of field; a low aperture, a shallow depth of field. Let's say we shoot a landscape and want everything sharp in our picture, the foreground and the background. Why not taking the highest f-stop number, the smallest aperture? The depth of field would be increased, but then the physics strikes with the diffraction blur and the image will lose in overall sharpness. That means the foreground will lose details and the background either. In numbers means that everything over the aperture 11 or beyond is nonsense. What you can see here. This was taken with the aperture of f8 and this at f22. Let's have a closer look on the details. With a strongly closed aperture, the light no longer falls onto the sensor in a point-like manner, but is scattered. Due to the narrower opening through which the light must pass, the light beams overlap. This results in a loss of sharpness. If my lens carries a description like 24 to 70mm f2.8, I can use the aperture 2.8 at every focal length and it is the widest opening of the lens. When I use a lens which has a described aperture of 3.5 to 5.6, then this lens has at its shortest focal length the aperture of 3.5, and with increasing focal length the aperture becomes smaller and smaller. Every lens has visible vignetting at the start aperture, this wide opening causing darkened corners in the image. The light rays which hit the corners of the sensor are shadowed because they don't get straight through the barrel of the lens. This is construction conditioned. You see the difference in the center of an image. It is brighter than the corners. But if you close the aperture, for example 5.6, the vignette becomes less, almost not more visible. And otherwise you can remove the vignette by software nowadays by one click. For me, is this the smartest way. Of course, it is easy to bump up the aperture if you have bright light conditions to darken the image. But the aperture is more a composing tool than an exposure tool. The important part is the depth of field. I would not recommend to take a portrait with f-stop 8 just because you get the maximum of overall sharpness. The background of the photo would become very fretful and the picture is then uncomfortable to watch. If you take landscape or architecture photos, the small apertures, high numbers 8, 9 and so on, are compulsory to reach the maximum level of sharpness. With a full depth of field, you let the viewer look in the far and allow him to explore things in the foreground at the same time. Topics like portraits or stills live off a calm background where the subject is undisturbed and can take effect on the viewer. It recommends to play with different apertures on the same motive, and to do all that you can choose manual mode or aperture priority on the camera. In aperture priority, the exposure is automatically compensated to the aperture, so one can consider freely try out. And a notice for myself what actually an f-stop is will I describe in another video. This is quite interesting and surprising. That's all for the aperture. I hope I could help with my explanations, and the best way to practice is of course to try out. For more photography topics you can visit Lightcolorshadow.com and can take a look on my gallery, and before I forget, leave a thumb up if you are satisfied with this video. And for questions you can leave a comment. So I hope we will see us in the next photography basics video, and until then, good light for you and until next time. Bye bye.